There are moments in the cosmos when silence speaks louder than the roar of starship engines, when a single act of mercy echoes across generations, when the smallest gesture of compassion becomes the foundation of legend. This is one of those stories. A tale not of empires or conquest, but of memory and honor, of debts paid not in currency, but in blood and steel. It begins in the most unlikely of places, on a world so insignificant that most star maps didn't bother to label it. And it begins with a species the galaxy had already forgotten. The Kalahari were feathered beings, no taller than a human child, with luminous eyes that reflected starlight even in darkness. They built their homes in spiral patterns, sang their histories instead of writing them, and believed that all intelligent life deserved dignity, regardless of origin or purpose. Their world, Threshold's End, orbited a dying red giant in a sector so remote that even pirates rarely bothered with it. There was nothing there worth stealing. Nothing except the Kalahari themselves, and they had never been considered valuable by anyone. 23 years ago, a young Terran named Garrett Voss crashed on Threshold's End. His exploration vessel had been caught in a gravitational anomaly, torn apart by forces he couldn't predict or escape. When he dragged himself from the wreckage, 3 ribs broken and his left arm twisted at an angle that made him want to scream, he expected to die alone on alien soil. Instead, he found feathers and kindness. The Kalahari pulled him from the debris. They carried him to their healing chambers where bioluminescent moss grew along the walls, and the air smelled of cinnamon and rain. They set his bones with patience and precision, fed him broths made from plants he couldn't name, and sat with him through the nightmares that followed. For 8 months, Garrett lived among them. He learned their clicking language, participated in their dawn ceremonies, and slowly understood that these gentle beings possessed a wisdom the galaxy had overlooked in its rush toward expansion and dominion. When they finally repaired a small shuttle for him, cobbling together parts from their own limited resources, Garrett wept. He promised he would return the favor someday, somehow. The eldest Kalahari, a female named Tesh with silver-tipped feathers, simply touched his forehead with her wingtip and sang a single phrase in her language. It translated roughly to, "Kindness requires no repayment, only remembrance." Garrett returned to Terran space and rejoined the exploration corps. The years passed like water through open fingers. He rose through the ranks, married, had children, watched his hair turn gray and his reflexes slow. He told the story of Threshold's End to anyone who would listen, but most dismissed it as the romantic memory of a young man who'd been concussed and grateful. The Kalahari became a footnote in his official reports, a species cataloged but not contacted, protected but not prioritized. Life moved on. The galaxy moved on, until the transmission arrived. It came through an emergency band that hadn't been used in decades, a frequency so old that most communication officers didn't even monitor it anymore. But someone in the Terran Deep Space Network caught it, a flickering signal like a candle in a hurricane. The message was brief, sent in broken Terran standard overlaid with Kalahari harmonics. The words were simple and devastating. "We are dying. The ones who gave shelter now need shelter. Threshold's End is under attack. We remember the human we saved. Please, if any humans remember us, please come." Then silence. The transmission reached Garrett Voss on New Vancouver, a colony world where he'd retired to teach xenobiology at the local university. He was in his garden when his old military communicator, a relic he'd kept as a memento, suddenly crackled to life. When he heard the Kalahari harmonics, his hands began to shake. He played the message 7 times, each repetition driving a spike deeper into his chest. By the 8th playback, he was already packing. His wife found him in the garage, pulling dusty equipment from storage containers. "Garrett," she said softly, "you're 71 years old. You haven't flown combat in 30 years. He looked at her with eyes that held no doubt, only determination. They saved my life when they had no reason to, when helping me put them at risk, when I was nobody to them except someone in pain. He slung a travel pack over his shoulder. I have to go. She didn't argue. She'd known him long enough to recognize when his mind was set. Instead, she helped him pack, kissed him goodbye, and watched as he drove toward the spaceport. As his transport lifted off into the colony's purple sky, she whispered a prayer to gods she didn't believe in. Bring him home. But Garrett wasn't thinking about coming home. He was thinking about Tesh's silver-tipped feathers, about the taste of that strange broth, about the song they sang when he left. Kindness requires no repayment, only remembrance. Well, he remembered. And he wasn't the only one. The message had been broadcast wide before being shut down, caught by relay stations across 3 sectors. It found its way into the inboxes of retired captains, into the mess halls of merchant vessels, into the private channels of smugglers and privateers who'd once worn Terran uniforms. Every human who heard it felt something stir in their chest, a collective recognition, a shared understanding. Somewhere in the outer reach, a cargo hauler captain named Tobias Wren listened to the transmission and immediately altered course. On the mining station, Crucible 7, a woman named Dex Holloway, who left the Terran Navy under a cloud of controversy, began fueling her old patrol ship. In the shadow markets of Port Resolve, a man who called himself Wraith and answered to no government started making calls to people who owed him favors. They came from everywhere and nowhere. Ships with scratched paint and mismatched hull plates. Vessels held together by spite and engineering talent. Captains with checkered pasts and crews with nothing to lose. Some had served with honor. Others had deserted. Some were heroes. Others were criminals. But every single one of them had heard stories about humanity's debts, about the unwritten rule that bound their species together across the stars. When someone saved a human, humans remembered. Within 48 hours, over 60 ships had set course for Threshold's End. No orders from Terran Command, no official sanction, no promise of payment or glory. Just a transmission and a memory. Just the knowledge that somewhere out there, a species who had asked for nothing was now asking for everything. Garrett Voss arrived at the rendezvous point first, his transport ship barely flight-worthy, running on fumes and determination. As other vessels began dropping out of faster-than-light travel around him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Purpose, pure and undiluted. He opened a general channel, his voice rough with age, but steady with conviction. To anyone listening, this isn't a military operation. This isn't sanctioned. If you're here for profit or glory, turn back now. But if you're here because you believe that kindness matters, that debts of honor transcend politics and borders, then welcome. Let's go save some lives. The responses came immediately. Dozens of voices, some young and some old, some human and some from allied species, who'd adopted human customs. They didn't speak in words. They spoke in action. Ship after ship aligned their vectors toward Threshold's End, engines burning bright against the void. And in that moment, the galaxy learned something it should have known all along. Humanity kept its promises, especially the ones that mattered most. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tailies from the stars. See you next time. The approach to Threshold's End was nothing like Garrett remembered. 23 years ago, the planet had glowed with a soft amber light, its surface dotted with the spiral cities of the Kalahari, their crystalline structures catching and refracting the rays of the dying red giant. Now, as the ragtag fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the system's edge, what greeted them was carnage. Orbital debris fields spun in chaotic patterns where defense stations had once maintained peaceful watch. Chunks of metal and frozen atmosphere created a deadly maze around the planet. Worst of all, 6 massive vessels hung in high orbit, like predators circling wounded prey. Their hulls were obsidian black, covered in angular plating that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Garrett's sensors identified them immediately, and his blood ran cold. The Chain Collective. Slavers, butchers, and worse. They didn't conquer worlds for resources or territory. They conquered them for flesh, for bodies to fuel their labor camps and fighting pits scattered across the lawless zones. The Kelhari, with their small stature and gentle nature, would be considered premium merchandise. Garrett's hands tightened on his control stick until his knuckles went white. Tobias Wren's voice crackled through the fleet channel, his merchant hauler hanging back near the system's edge. Those are Harvester-class ships, full combat configuration. They've got plasma batteries, fighter bays, and boarding pods. His pause was heavy. We're outgunned 3-1, maybe worse. Dex Holloway's patrol ship, the Broken Promise, moved forward with surprising grace for a vessel held together with patch welds and improvised armor. Her voice was sharp, almost amused. Then it's a fair fight. I've taken worse odds. This isn't a joke, Holloway, another captain snapped. Half our ships are unarmed transports. We're not a military fleet. No, Garrett interrupted, his voice cutting through the growing argument. We're not. We're something else. Something they won't expect. He pulled up tactical displays, his decades of training flooding back despite the years. The collective expects easy prey. They've seen the Kalahari defenses fall. They think they own this system already. That makes them complacent. What's the plan, old man? Asked Wraith, his stealth corvette practically invisible on sensors. His reputation preceded him, a ghost who de-operated in the shadows for so long that most people thought he was a myth. But he was here, and that meant something. Garrett's mind raced, pulling together strategy from memory and desperation. We split into 3 groups. The armed vessels, anything with weapons. You're with Holloway. You're going to make noise, draw their attention, hit their flanks hard and fast. Make them think you're the main threat. The transports and haulers, you're with Wren. You're going to use the debris field as cover and slip past their cordon. Get to the surface, evacuate as many Kalahari as possible. And you? Holloway asked. What's the third group? Garrett smiled grimly. Anyone with boarding equipment and more guts than sense, you're with me. We're going to give them something they really won't expect. His next words were deliberate, carrying the weight of absolute commitment. We're going to board their command ship and rip its heart out. The channel went silent for 3 full seconds. Then Rafe laughed, a sound like grinding metal. I knew I liked you, old man. Count me in. One by one, others volunteered. Ships that had no business attempting boarding actions. Crews that consisted of engineers and miners, and merchants who de-learned to fight because the galaxy demanded it. They weren't soldiers. They were humans. And that made all the difference. The attack began 12 minutes later. Holloway's combat group swept in from the northern approach, weapons blazing. Her Broken Promise might have looked like scrap, but her plasma cannons were military-grade, salvaged and upgraded over years of careful modification. She led a formation of 8 armed vessels, everything from old patrol boats to a converted mining rig that mounted railguns meant for asteroid processing. The collective responded exactly as Garrett predicted. Their fighters launched in swarms, black insects against the stars. Their capital ships rotated to face the threat, plasma batteries charging with deadly purpose. They were professional, efficient, and completely focused on the obvious danger, which meant they didn't notice the dozen small ships slipping through the debris field below the orbital plane. Wren piloted his hauler with a delicacy that betrayed his years of threading through asteroid fields. Behind him, transports and cargo vessels followed in single file, using the wreckage of Kalahari defense stations as cover. One transport clipped a spinning piece of hull plating and veered off course, but the pilot corrected, heart pounding, and kept moving. On the planet's surface, The Kalahari huddled in their underground shelters, listening to the thunder of battle above. Tesh, now ancient by her species standards, held the youngest ones close, her silver-tipped feathers dulled with age. She sang softly, the old songs of peace and patience. But in her heart, she held on to a fragile hope. The human had promised to remember. Perhaps other humans remembered too. Above, Garrett's boarding group made their approach from the planet's shadow, using the red giant's radiation to mask their signatures. 5 ships, each small and fast. Wraith's corvette led the way, his sensors painting a path through the collective sensor grid. They moved in silence, running dark, every unnecessary system powered down. The collective command ship was a fortress, bristling with point defense systems and armored like a vault. But every fortress had weaknesses. Garrett had studied collective ship designs during his military service, back when the Terran Navy considered them enough of a threat to warrant intelligence gathering. He knew their blind spots, the places where their confidence made them sloppy. "We're going for the ventral docking bay," he transmitted on tight beam. "It's meant for captured ships, so their defenses face outward, not inward. Once we're inside, we fight our way to engineering and overload their reactor. We don't need to destroy the ship, just disable it long enough for the others to do their jobs." "And if we can't reach engineering?" someone asked, fear evident in their voice. "Then we make them pay for every meter," Garrett replied simply. "We buy time with blood. That's what humans do best." They hit the docking bay at full burn, magnetic clamps engaging before the collective could respond. Cutting torches flared to life, slicing through the outer door. Alarms screamed. Internal defenses activated. And 43 humans poured into the belly of a slaver ship with fury in their hearts and weapons in their hands. The collective soldiers were reptilian, scaled and powerful, bred for combat and enhanced with cybernetics. They outnumbered the boarding party 3-1. They had better armor, better weapons, better training. On paper, it should have been a massacre. But humans don't fight on paper. They fight with rage and creativity and the absolute refusal to quit. A miner named Hassan used his industrial torch to melt through a bulkhead, creating a new path when the main corridor was blocked. A young woman named Cora, barely 20, threw herself into enemy fire to pull a wounded crewmate to safety, taking 2 plasma bolts in her armor and getting back up anyway. Wraith moved through the corridors like his namesake, appearing behind enemy positions and disappearing before they could retaliate. And Garrett Voss, 71 years old with artificial knees and a heart that had to work twice as hard, led from the front with a rifle that had been old when he was young. He'd told his wife he might not come home. As he watched his people fight and bleed and refuse to break, he made peace with that possibility, because some debts were worth dying for. Some promises were sacred, and the Kalahari had saved him when they had every reason not to. Now it was his turn. Now it was humanity's turn. The battle raged on 3 fronts, in orbit, on approach, and inside the command ship itself. And across all 3, one truth became clear. The collective had made a terrible mistake. They'd attacked a species that humans remembered fondly. And humanity, for all its flaws and contradictions, protected its own, even when its own included gentle, feathered beings on a forgotten world that most of the galaxy had never heard of. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more stories from the far reaches of space. The corridors of the collective command ship ran red with blood from both sides. Garrett pushed forward through the smoke and chaos, his old rifle hot in his hands, his lungs screaming for air that wasn't thick with the stench of scorched metal and death. Around him, his boarding party fought with a ferocity that defied all military doctrine. They weren't trained special forces. They were ordinary people who had decided that some things, some principles, mattered more than their own survival. Hassan was the first to fall, taking a plasma bolt meant for the woman beside him. He died with his industrial torch still clutched in his hand, a tool he'd used to cut through 7 bulkheads, forging paths where none existed. Cora held his hand as the light left his eyes, then she picked up his torch and kept moving forward. There were no speeches, no dramatic final words. Just the grim, silent acceptance that this was the cost, and they would pay it gladly. Engineering was 3 decks below. Wraith's voice crackled through the comms, breathless and strained. Heavy resistance at Junction 12. They're bringing in reinforcements. We need to move faster, or we're going to be trapped. In that moment, Garrett made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He split the group. He would take 20 people and push for engineering. The rest would create a defensive line to hold their only escape route. He looked into the eyes of the volunteers who would stay behind, saw their fear and their courage intertwined, and felt something inside his chest break. "You're buying us 5 minutes," he told them. "Make them count." A man named Fenris, who'd been a teacher before he fled his colony world for reasons he never spoke of, simply nodded. "We'll give you 10. Then he smiled, and it was the saddest thing Garrett had ever seen. "Tell people we mattered, old man. Tell them we stood for something." And they did. Against waves of collective soldiers, that small group of humans held a corridor that should have fallen in seconds. They fought with empty weapons when the ammunition ran out, then with tools and fists and teeth when everything else failed. Fenris died standing, his body propped against a bulkhead. His final act was activating a magnetic containment failure, turning the corridor behind him into a death trap for the pursuing soldiers. He saved 15 people he'd met only 2 days before. Garrett reached engineering with just 12 survivors. The chamber was massive, dominated by a pulsing reactor core that radiated heat like a captured star. The collective technicians scattered at their approach, unarmed and unprepared. Garrett let them run. They weren't soldiers. They were just doing their jobs. But the reactor, that was fair game. Wraith moved to the control panels, his fingers dancing across the alien interfaces. "I can trigger a cascade overload. It won't destroy the ship, but it'll knock out power for at least an hour. Maybe 2 if we're lucky." He paused, his scarred face illuminated by the reactor's glow. "But someone needs to stay and manually override the safety protocols. The system will fight the shutdown every step of the way." Before Garrett could even speak, a young engineer named Petrie stepped forward. She joined the convoy from a mining station, running from debts and bad decisions. Her hands shook, but her voice was steady. "I'll do it. I know reactor systems. I can hold it long enough." Garrett wanted to argue, to find another way, but time was a luxury they didn't have. Outside the engineering bay, he could hear weapons fire getting closer. The collective was regrouping, bringing in heavier forces. He looked at Petrie, this young woman who had found her redemption among the stars, and he nodded. "Make it count." She smiled, a real smile, as if a great weight had been lifted from her. "I already have." The remaining boarding party fought their way back through corridors they had paid for in blood. Behind them, Petrie worked frantically at the controls, her fingers flying across the panel as warning alarms screamed and the reactor spiraled toward a controlled failure. When collective soldiers finally breached the engineering bay, she didn't run. She simply triggered the final override and whispered a quiet prayer to the parents she had left behind years ago. The command ship went dark. Every light, every weapon, every system shut down in a cascading blackout. In orbit, Commander Holloway saw the massive vessel go silent and knew immediately what it meant. Someone had done the impossible. Someone had paid the price. "Now!" she screamed into her communicator. "Hit them now, while they're blind." The assembled human fleet, battered and bleeding, pressed their advantage. Without their command ship coordinating defenses, the collective formation fell into disarray. Ships collided as they tried to maneuver without guidance. Fighter wings scattered, lost and leaderless. And into that chaos, Humanity poured everything they had left. Down on the surface of the planet, Wren's transports had made landfall near the largest Kalahari settlement. The feathered beings emerged from their shelters, their eyes wide with disbelief, as humans in mismatched armor gestured frantically for them to board the ships. Tesh, the ancient elder, approached Wren, her body moving slowly. She touched his face with her wingtip in the traditional Kalahari greeting. "You came," she sang in her language, the words translating through his suit's computer. "You remembered." Wren, a hard man who spent 30 years in the void and thought he'd forgotten how to feel, found tears on his cheeks. "Of course we did. You saved one of us. That means you're one of us." The evacuation was chaos and beauty intertwined. Kalahari children clutched precious items, their elders carried by humans who'd never met them before. Families huddled together in cargo holds meant for grain and ore. The transports lifted off under fire, their hulls scarred by plasma bolts, but they lifted off. One by one, they clawed their way back to orbit, carrying their precious cargo to safety. Garrett's battered shuttle made it back to his transport ship with 6 survivors, 6 out of 43. He collapsed in the airlock, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers, and finally let the grief wash over him. Hassan, Fenris, Petri, and 34 others whose names he would never forget, whose faces would visit his dreams for whatever time he had left. The price had been steep. The price had been terrible. But the Kalahari lived. In the aftermath of the battle, as the collective fleet retreated and human ships began securing the system, Garrett sat in his quarters and recorded a message. His hands shook as he spoke, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "This is Garrett Voss, to anyone who finds this record. Today, humans died for a species most of the galaxy has never heard of. They died for people who couldn't repay them, who had nothing to offer except gratitude. They died because 23 years ago, I was shown kindness when I expected death." He paused, wiping his eyes. "I want their names remembered. I want the galaxy to know that Hassan the miner, Fenris the teacher, Petri the engineer, and all the others stood against evil not for profit or glory, but because it was right. Because someone had to. Because that's what humans do when they remember kindness." The message spread across Terran space like wildfire. In bars and mess halls, in universities and military academies, people listened to the old man's broken voice and felt something stir in their chests. Pride, perhaps. Or maybe recognition. The understanding that humanity, despite all its violence and chaos, could still choose to be better. The Kalahari survivors were given sanctuary on 3 different human colony worlds. Tesh chose to stay with Garrett on New Vancouver, spending her final years teaching human children the songs of her people. When she died 2 years later, 5,000 humans attended her funeral, many of them veterans of the battle. They sang her songs in broken Kalahari, their voices rough but sincere, and laid her to rest under a tree that would bloom with silver flowers every spring. Garrett lived another 8 years, long enough to see a memorial built on Threshold's End, reconstructed by human and Kalahari hands, working side by side. Long enough to watch Kalahari children play with human children, their differences celebrated rather than feared. Long enough to know that the debt had been paid, that the promise had been kept, that kindness had been answered with kindness. On the day he died, surrounded by family and friends, both human and Kalahari, his last words were simple. "We remembered." And that made all the difference.